Welcome to Post-Doom, regenerative conversations exploring overshoot grief, grounding, and gratitude. I'm Connie Barlow. I'm one of the two video editors for this series. The host is Michael Dowd. I'm Michael Dowd's wife, and I'm retired, so I'm doing this as a volunteer. And I'm coming on this just to give a notion of what's important about this particular timing for this conversation that was actually recorded 6 months ago. Today is April 13th, 2020, and this was recorded back towards the end of October in 2019. Now, what I find astonishing about this is how absolutely relevant it is for having a sense of how we move forward in this time of coronavirus fright, basically, going on. Again, this is mid-April. And the lessons here, the presence that Denise Rushing has, who is the guest in this particular recording, is so relevant for now. And I think part of the reason of that is post-doom, or how you come through doom or crisis, and working at a very local level when you lose faith in being able to do much at higher levels. How important that was that she learned it already beyond the abstract. Most of us just talk about it in the abstract. Well, she went through the ranch fire of August 2018, and this conversation was recorded a little over a year later. So she had the benefit of being able to reflect on a real crisis in her community that came right down to her house and wiped out so many other houses in the area. This is in California, north of San Francisco, but a very dry area. And her wisdom here is so relevant for these times. We've titled this conversation, To Do Our Best. Here are the three previews.
I encountered permaculture at a time in my life where I was feeling the doom, right? Because, those who have paying attention, I've been paying attention since I was 9 years old. We learned about global warming in my science class. And oddly enough, this is back in, I turned 10 years old in 1968. And at that time, Neil Armstrong walked on the moon. We saw Earth from space for the first time. Everybody was so incredibly hopeful about what science could do for the world. And we learned about global warming right around that time. And I believed, I went off and I became, an engineer. I studied science because I wanted to build Star Trek, basically. I wanted to build the Star Trek future. And somewhere along the way, humanity kind of went off the rails. And what I realized is it wasn't us so much as that it was the idea that technology would save us without a change of consciousness. As a culture, we have a lot to grieve, right? We're grieving literally our dreams of the past. We imagined ourselves to be a certain way, and we're not that, and the grief cycle it starts with denial, and it moves into other things, but it starts with denial, and it ends up in anger, and eventually in acceptance and commitment. And so you can't get to acceptance and commitment fully unless you get through the rest of it. And those difficult emotions, I feel, one of the advantages of being over age 40 these days is you've probably experienced a loss, that you then know that loss isn't forever. I mean, you lose something or someone, but eventually you can live again. And when you're young, a loss feels like life is over. You don't realize that you can come back. I was working on technology. I was working in the energy industry. I mean, I was working on solar and things like that, but I was very, very intellectual with my saving of the planet. And now my saving of the planet had become deeply personal. Yeah. And so what comes out of the other side, for me, is more commitment, but also more peace, realizing that I'm one person, and that was the gift of permaculture. I'm one person doing what I'm called to do, and eliciting that from others, hopefully. And if everyone steps up, we will have done our best. And that is what is.
The conversation begins. Well, Denise, what a joy to see your face again, to hear your voice again, and to have you as part of this post-doom conversation series. I was particularly interested in having you because of your background in energy or communal living, your farming, permaculture, just a whole range of things. And also to ask you, I mean, y'all have dealt with serious fire, and I understand recently you were just part of those who were without power.
Mhm.
So there's a whole lot that I would love for you to touch on or address. But before we do that, I would just want to ask you, for those people who are watching this or listening to this who don't know who you are, they've never read anything of yours, help us get you.
Locally, I'm known for community leadership. I was elected to county office here. But really what I'm about is applying permaculture or ecological design to human systems, to, literally transform human systems. That's what I write about. That's what I care about. And it's also what keeps me sane in, sort of a crazy world. We're in Northern California. I'm on a farm here with 3 other adults, actually 4 sometimes. And our farm has been the site of a lot of permaculture education here, even before I ran for office. And then when I ran for office, I actually literally took the Earth Charter and applied it to the local community and said, this is what my platform's going to be. And I had only lived here about a year. I didn't really think I had a shot at winning, but the message really resonated with people. It's about healing, healing communities, healing the lake.
You mentioned the lake, but you didn't mention where you're from.
Yeah, so I'm from Lake County, California, and the county is dominated by Clear Lake, one of the oldest lakes in the world, and certainly the oldest lake in the Northern Hemisphere, and one of the most biologically diverse lakes on the planet. And Clear Lake was actually one of the places Rachel Carson wrote about in Silent Spring, because the agriculture surrounding the lake affected the Grieves back in the 50s and 60s, and changing agricultural practices brought the wildlife back. So it's an amazing lake. It's also very much alive, and it very much talks to us about what we're doing to the landscape that surrounds us. And you may not know this, but 60+% of the lands, the watershed surrounding Clear Lake, burned in the wildfires since 2015.
Well, I do know that, and I wanted to ask you about that. How has the regrowth been? What's the recovery been?
Well, in permaculture, the problem is an opportunity, right? So it's been a massive problem. And the opportunity that sort of is presenting itself is a really different way of people working together in community and connecting with one another. And I'll give you a couple of examples in a moment. But let me just say, starting in 2015, we had some massive wildfires. The ones in 2015 and 2016 took out probably 2,200 homes in a community that has only 65,000 residents and only 45,000 homes. And then fire last year in 2018 burned almost the entire national forest in our area and actually came right to our neighbor's place. We had fire trucks along the road that were protecting our home the night of August 3rd. And when we got back home, we had been evacuated for like 12 days. When we got back home, there were signs of embers everywhere, and the ladder was against our house, and the fire trucks there were signs that they were here helping save our homes that night. And so we know, as a community, there isn't anyone here who hasn't been touched by these fires in some way. Either the friends have lost homes, or they were evacuated, or they lost their home. So we're all in this, we're realizing that recovery is part of life now. It's just part of what we're about. Because fire and the fire recovery has been so prevalent in our community, we have people in the community that went through the fires in 2015 that are now mentoring those who are going through the fires in 2018. Some people who have emerged as leaders in Northern California in helping people in Paradise and in other places learn how to recover from fires. It's kind of sad to say, but we're really good at this. And we're getting better at it anyway. And so now the next phase of this are these outages, because the utility doesn't want to be liable for starting fires. So we had last week, we had 4 days, or a week and a half ago, 4 days out of power. We had a little bit of notice, but everybody coped in different ways. There were gas lines for people trying to get gas for the generators. And I had set up a system where literally our refrigerator and our freezer, we rode out the outages okay, because I had literally filled half of the freezer with blocks of ice, right, that had containers of ice. So
Yeah.
so my freezer is half filled with ice, and so the ice gets to melt over the course of 4 days and
Right.
keeps the food cold. But it was a real hardship economically. Businesses can't be out 4 days and also lose all their inventory and still survive on a regular basis. And then today, PG&E says they may be cutting power again to some communities in our area. This one isn't targeted, but you never know. So if I suddenly go, you'll know the power is gone. So there's this reality of the day-to-day, and that I mentioned that the problem is an opportunity. The upside is that not only are we connecting as community more, but we're realizing how fragile our systems are and how we need more redundancy in the systems that we have. And we're also realizing, there's some people that really enjoyed time away from their screens. It was actually a blessing.
Yeah,
we started
amen.
talking with other people and connecting with other people. So there was a little bit of that, and a number of us, and I mentioned to you earlier that I'm involved in co-founding a college that is centered around regeneration of place and people, right? So New Paradigm College is centered on ecosystem regeneration.
Say a lot more about that, because that's right on topic.
Right. Well, if you go to newparadigmcollege.org, you can see sort of the kinds of things that we're doing. But what we're centered on is the regeneration of this place, Lake County, California, which has been so devastated. And we feel that the tools that we bring, like permaculture and spiritual connection and art and the kinds of tools that we bring to regeneration of place can be applied anywhere. They'll be applied differently in other places, but they could be applied anywhere. And what we're finding is that students, college students particularly now, don't want to sit around for 4 years learning from books. They want to engage in actually producing something during their college years. Yes. And so we offer that up. We will be offering that opportunity. I think we're about 1.5 years away from having a program that will be accredited, or at least under the umbrella of an accredited institution. Right now, the programs that we're offering are very much community focused. So we're engaging the community in permaculture classes and ecosystem regeneration projects. We're going to probably launch an ecosystem restoration camp next year. And we've been bringing in premier speakers like Charles Eisenstein and others to really set the stage for the kinds of soul work that you have to do in order to do this ecosystem regeneration work. And I personally feel I'm really committed to it, because I feel that as we heal ecosystems, it's a good idea for so many reasons, but one of the good reasons is that it heals us too. We start healing the land and the land heals us. And not to mention the fact that it's a massive economic boom when you start doing large scale ecosystem regeneration. So learning the tool, learning how to do it and then doing it is what we're about.
Well, in addition to your, being involved locally, politically, and also your, permaculture farm, your experience there, say a little bit about your books, because you've written a number of books all related to themes related to this conversation series. Yeah,
the themes of my books have really been about applying permaculture to personal and community transformation. Personal transformation in that I encountered permaculture at a time in my life where I was feeling the doom, right? Because, those who have paying attention, I've been paying attention since I was 9 years old. We learned about global warming in my science class. And oddly enough, this is back in, I turned 10 years old in 1968. And at that time, Neil Armstrong walked on the moon. We saw Earth from space for the first time. Everybody was so incredibly hopeful about what science could do for the world. And we learned about global warming right around that time. And I believed, I went off and I became, an engineer. I studied science because I wanted to build Star Trek, basically. I wanted to build the Star Trek future. And somewhere along the way, humanity kind of went off the rails. And what I realized is it wasn't us so much as that it was the idea that technology would save us without a change of consciousness. And so in that process, we had all these ideas of things we would learn to do and implement. And right now, all those technologies, almost all of them have come to pass. I mean, we've gotten solar down to be cheaper than fossil fuels. We've got electric cars. All these things we said we would try to build, we've been able to build, but our consciousness has not evolved that much since then. And in fact, we've gone from a hopeful people to a people that's looking around us going, oh my God, what have we done? And we're not so hopeful. I think the crisis these days is a crisis of leadership and crisis of the human spirit. So from that time, from 1968 till now, I went through the whole scene. I went from working on technology and energy and all that to realizing, oh my gosh, I went through the doom phase where I was like, what are we doing?
Yeah.
And it was permaculture that brought me back. And I would say maybe a little bit of, I also became a private pilot at the time. And I think becoming a private pilot actually was part of the story, because I had an in-flight emergency when I was learning to fly, and
Wow.
the engine quit actually.
Oh my gosh.
So I had to land the plane without the engine working. And what you're taught, you're given all kinds of training as a pilot. And the main thing you're taught is, in an emergency, fly the plane. Even if you have to fly it into the ground, don't stop flying the plane. Don't give up.
Yep.
So even if you're flying the plane and you have to fly it into trees because you can't lift up, you fly it so that the fuselage goes between the trees and shears the wings off.
Even if you're flying at trees and you can't lift it
if you're
up?
flying at trees, you would fly it so that you would fly it between the trees, and the trees would shear your wings off and slow the plane as you descend, right? So you're taught, fly the plane.
Mm-hmm.
And I feel like that's what the spiritual issue of where we're about these days is. We're in this emergency. Everyone can feel it in their bones. And if they're not feeling it, they're in denial, and one of the phases of denial. And I feel like for me, it's about flying the plane. Like, just do what's yours to do it with joy, do it as much as you can, fly the plane, and we still have a shot at pulling up. It may happen, it may not.
Yeah, depending upon what pulling up means, sure, yeah.
Yeah.
Wow.
It may happen. And do what's yours to do. So that's what I'm focused on now. And it was permaculture that brought that about for me. So my story, what I write about is I write about, well, why is permaculture a way forward in difficult times? And I feel it is because it allows us to be in action, in hopeful action, in a way that's joyful, and is a way that is ours to do. And I feel that that's an antidote for a lot of what ails us. And then we get to heal ourselves as we're healing, communities and places. So
yeah. Well, I mean, one of the things that I resonated so much with you when Connie and I stayed at your place is the bringing together of permaculture, sort of what I call a deep green heart, but a real commitment to the future, pro-nature, but also a deep appreciation of Thomas Berry and Brian Swim and the whole universe story and that sort of thing. Say a little bit about how this big picture, how the universe story or epic of evolution, or what Connie and I call the great story, the story that includes all the stories, how does that perspective inspire you or help you or comfort you or in some way sort of assist you in your work and just your living?
Wow, that's a beautiful question. Thank you. First of all, I would say I'm an implementer. I like to take action in a direction, and I want to know in my heart that direction is a worthy one, that it's one that it's worth my life energy, and that's why. And I see permaculture as a subset of Thomas Berry's work. In fact, he even wrote about it as one of the design tools for moving forward with the new story. But I will say this about the new story. When I first encountered Thomas Berry and Brian Swim's work, I was really unsettled about it, because in a way it was a new theology, and all the old rituals and all the old theologies didn't seem to matter as much as this new story. Mm-hmm. And I realized that we're evolving the rituals and our way of interacting with the story just as the universe story evolves. In fact, I think one of the big ahas for me was that our lives are like the new story, right? We start out, if you look at the new story, there are these moments of grace, and there are these moments of of serendipity, and there's this constant evolutionary force that brings you forward. Well, I saw that and I realized that's true for every one of us. So how you live the new story is you evolve and you try to evolve as best you can. So for me, the new story, in a way, it gave me hope, because it made me realize that God was a process as much as a reality.
That God is the sacred name that we give to that reality, that process in which we live and move and have our being, and that is our source, our sustenance, and everything else.
Exactly. So this flaring forth of life and love is ongoing. It's not a stagnant thing, and we keep trying to make order out of chaos and make it stagnant and figure it out. But it what it did for me is it allowed me to sort of step back and say, you know what, there's not a real answer here. It's okay to allow the unfolding and just to align yourself with it as best you can. And so it led me to identify ways that I would know whether I was aligned or that I wasn't. And I started to look for little signs and signals, like, I know I'm not aligned when I lose my sense of humor, or when I'm feeling stress. I know that I'm just not, it's not working. And so when I step back in and sink back into the reality of everything will be okay. We're in an adventure, is what it's saying. The new story is saying this is all an adventure. It's the hero's journey, and so what's next?
Yeah. I mean, it puts my faith in something much larger and longer lasting than any one species, including my own.
When we align with creativity, we're aligning with the universe story. And so permaculture is just a tool, and there are other tools too. Art is an amazing tool. I think entrepreneurship is an amazing tool, sort of creating something from nothing. It's all about creativity and aligning with the creative. And so when you see people who are genuinely depressed, I mean, there's a lot to be depressed about, I get that. But when you see people that are genuinely depressed and gloomy, often it's because they're not aligned with the creative force and they're not being creative in these times. This is a time for creativity, ultimately. And so find yours would be my message to anyone. And mine happens to be right now community. How do we turn this community into one of regeneration? How do we regenerate from so many devastating? And if we can do it in Lake County with like one of the worst economies in California, the highest unemployment, if we can do it here, then anybody could do it. Yeah. So that's my goal.
Yeah, no, well, that's a wonderful vision. And I think that sense of applying regenerative practices to whatever situation you find yourself in, making do, participating, as you say, in this creative process, which is life, which is the universe story, is not only the thing that can give us sanity and can nourish us at a deep soul level in our local communities, but it's also the only way into the future. I mean, if our species survives this bottleneck, which we might very well survive it, and we might not. I mean, who knows? Time will tell. But nonetheless, practices of regeneration, practices of co-creating along ecologically sane and pro-future lines is our only way into the future. So it's holy work, whether our species lasts another 50 years or another 5 million years. Right. This is the holy work of our time. And
I agree. And I find it interesting. Charles Eisenstein was here, and one of the more profound things he said, he's an amazing man, but one of the profound things he said while here was, it's possible that humans will survive just fine. In fact, we're pretty adaptive. It's pretty likely that we'll survive, but we may not, the rest of life might not. We might create a future that is absolutely not that interesting and good to be in. And he thinks that's a worse outcome than not surviving at all, maybe, is that we've killed everything else. And what kind of future would that be? Yeah. So the times we're in part, are to signal to life that we want it here with us, that we want to create these ecosystems for life to thrive, independent of us, that we want, the hummingbirds and the frogs and the ecosystems and the trees. We want these things.
Yeah, ultimately only life-centeredness, ecocentrism,
Yeah.
not
Yeah.
anthropocentrism, is sustainable, seems
Yeah,
to me.
exactly. Well, and as we bring life back, there's a real joy in that too. As
Yes.
we, I was watching some of the work of John Liu, who runs ecosystem restoration camps.org, right? He's doing involved in large scale ecosystem regeneration. And I guess as a journalist, he's been documenting the collapse of ecosystems around the world. And he's now documenting the restoration and the regeneration of ecosystems and humans' role in doing that. And what he finds is that you have to start locally. It can't be some group that comes in from the outside.
Absolutely.
It has to be, you need funding from the outside. You definitely need that. And there's plenty of funding when people are wanting to invest in climate work or whatever. Corporations, departments of defense will invest in ecosystem regeneration. And he's lining up those kinds of resources for communities. But it takes the community to really know what it means to bring a place back.
Yes.
What was here before, what needs to be here now in these new times, this new climate. So anyway, that work I think that's the work going forward, and I believe that that's going to be the job of many young people. I mean, I've met young people who want to devote their lives to that work of bringing back.
No doubt. Most people involved in regeneration have had to make a shift, it seems to me, certainly in the conversations I've had so far, from say 5 to 8 years ago, genuinely believing that we were going to transform the systems along regenerative lines, to where now there's just not quite that faith or confidence that we'll regenerate the systems, even though this is still the holy work that we just spoke about.
I don't know if you'll find very many conscious human beings who believe we won't face a major crisis. And I don't know that I can tell you that I think that much about it anymore. As a child, and when I said that, I was a scientist at heart, I was really a sensitive soul, but I was also a scientist. And there are a couple things in science and in the news story that actually give me hope, even as we see this deterioration around us. One of them is this idea of phase change. You can boil water on a stove and turn the burner on underneath it. If you had a thermometer in that water, when it starts to boil until it's gone, that thermometer stays at 212 degrees, even though a massive amount of energy is going into that pot to boil the water. It's going in, it's going in, it's going, and it's turning the water to steam. So that phase change, there's so much energy stored in the system, that the structure that exists, and the energy is being released in the bonds of, from going from liquid to gas, and true to going from, solid to liquid. Ice will stay at 32 degrees until it's totally melted, and then the water temperature can rise. So the idea of phase change, I feel like whenever you're in a system that's undergoing massive change, a lot of things are happening, and energy is going into the system, and you don't really know what's going to happen. Tomorrow we could see the kinds of systemic changes we've been working on for so long. We could begin to see some of those emerge as the dominant systems.
But you really believe that?
Well, I think the systems that we have are dysfunctional and collapsing.
Well,
so
I totally
there
get
isn't
that.
an institution that I grew up believing in that isn't facing issues right now. Some of them are existential issues, and some of them are lack of trust in that. So, I mean, institutions, and I'll use Lake County as an example. Our county is broke after all these fires. There's not a lot that the government can barely hold together collecting the taxes, and they're not even doing that well. I mean, they're really struggling here. And if you dig a little deeper into the poverty that might exist in the various parts of our area, you will find incredible barter systems already there. You will find, we were one of the fastest growing time banks in the United States. You'd find a lot of systems that are allowing people to survive and live. They may not be altruistic, some of them. There's a whole system of mini storage, selling off people's possessions that people buy and things secondhand. There's a lot of, and there's an undercurrent of a drug economy too. So you have systems on all sides, sort of.
Right.
None of them have dominated the region, but a lot of new ideas are bubbling up on all sides. So it's possible in a time of phase change that you'll see something emerge. And I think the balances can be tipped based on who's working on that. You know, if everybody gives up, then the ones who keep working are going to be the ones that win in the end. But the work has to be one that's joyful, in my view, for us to sustain it. I don't think we're going to sustain it out of fear, certainly. So do I believe that it's possible to still have better systems? I still do. But like I said, I don't think about it that much because I feel like I'm flying the airplane, right? I'm really just flying the plane. That we're taking on all kinds of hits right now as a culture. And, you know, one of the things I did last year is I went to the Amazon, as you know, we were heading off to the Amazon, met with the Ashwar and the Sapara people at their invitation through the Pachamama Alliance. And those people that live in harmony with their living system that surrounds them are pretty happy. What scares them is the destruction of that system.
Exactly.
But genuinely, they're living. They are part of all things in their region. And when we were there with them, we were part of those things too. And it sort of reminds you that it's possible to live much simpler, even if the systems around you have to change or are gone. So I'm not going to pretend to know what those new systems are going to be. I know there are a lot of people thinking about that, and I'm one that really wants to work on making sure that natural systems are here for us and for the future for themselves. It's so easy to entertain despair, and and yet I don't, I'm not denying all that's going on. It's pretty awful. Politically, it's awful. Ecologically, it's awful. Culturally, it's awful. Right. And so what do I want to spend my time on? I want to spend my time on recreating culture, recreating economy, recreating politics, recreating ecosystems. So that's what, if we can do it on a local level, you get the fractal effect. It'll happen in all places eventually. At least we go down knowing we did our best.
Yes,
right?
Exactly. However bad things get or not so bad things get, it's going to be differential. Some places are going to do better than others. And what happens locally now and in the coming weeks and months and years is going to could potentially make a huge difference in terms of how well or how not well stuff happens when the poop hits the fan a little more severely.
Right. Well, and it's starting to hit the fan now. And I would say if I were going to invest my time in my community, and as I'm investing my time, I'm investing in a couple of things. One is I'm investing in connecting people with each other. Because if people are connected, even if they have differing political views, the odds of them attacking each other go down because they know each other. I mean, we have a guy who comes to our orchard and does work who is absolutely the opposite politically from me. But we have good conversations. We joke around with one another. We're friends for all intents and purposes. And it's hard to go talk politics with him because I get, frustrated. But we actually have a connection. So if collapse comes, I don't doubt that he will still be my friend.
Exactly.
So connecting people is one way. And then of course, restoring ecosystems another. And so why not do all at the same time? Why not get people together in groups so they can connect with one another and do the work? That's one way.
Amen.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's hard to not look at the external things that are out of my control and not feel frustrated. I mean, I usually go on a news diet, a couple days in a row. And truth is, you can catch up pretty fast. Even though things are happening so quickly, you can catch up with the news pretty quickly. So sometimes I take a break from that.
Certainly going on a news fast is a good thing. I do that myself. I sometimes go 2 or 3 days without checking the news specifically so that I can stay focused. But what are other things that you practices or exercises that you would rather have done that support you?
Well, that's a great question. I think everybody has their own. I think the first for me is to stay connected with myself, my source, and my spirituality. And so, just any kind of meditative practice, right? I love this time of year for us. We harvest walnuts every fall, and we tend to hand harvest them. And there's a reason we do it. Part of it is just it's a spiritual practice. We're outside. We're on the ground half the time. We're picking walnuts up off the ground. And I really love this time of year for that reason. It's very centering for me. I also paint. I mean, I do art, or clay or paint. Not because I think I'm that good at it, but because I just feel like when I do it, I'm in a creative flow.
If those are your paintings behind you, you do pretty damn good.
Yeah, these are actually, that's so this is like one of, I paint earth all the time, and I don't know why that is. It's probably news story related. And I feel like what I'm doing when I'm painting earth is I'm just healing her. I'm in this meditative space where I'm just imagining the healing of the whole. And that's why that's why I think earth keeps coming up in my paintings. I don't know. But I do that, I set aside time for creativity, and I notice when I don't. So I've been involved in a startup project for a while, and I had to sort of schedule time for myself, because it literally, when you're in a project that's starting up, you can take all your time in that. And I had to schedule time for myself and say, I'm going to be taking these self-care breaks, so that I can renew my energies and make sure that I'm fresh. And those are the things I do with my time. And this year I didn't have a vegetable garden, but I have a perennial garden. So I often get outside in the garden just to observe what's going on out there. One summer I dug a little pond, and I made a mistake, and I put it a little too close to the house, so the frogs are really loud out there. But that, just having that little piece of life and water for the creatures, the bees come, and all the pollinators are there, the frogs are there, and having that little oasis every day, I can go out and I can see the dragonflies and the hummingbirds, and everybody has a little bit of water, and having that little spot has been life-giving for me. So that's what I do.
Wow. Well, Denise, one of the things I wanted to ask around mortality, impermanence, death, how has your contemplating sort of that the finality, endings, limits, including the limits of our lives, how has that informed or supported you in this regenerative work, permaculture work that you do?
That's a good question. I guess in a couple of ways. One is, anytime you're working in nature, particularly in gardening or in farming, you realize that death yields to life, right? So the goal is to create the cycles. In permaculture, the goal is to create the cycles. And so you get to observe that, the vegetables of last year became the soil for this year. You get to observe death. Mm-hmm. So when I think about death, I think about life, when I'm in the garden. But as far as my own, I have 2 grandchildren now. They've just turned 2. And I realized that we've given them a world that wasn't the world we were given. And I hope that I live long enough to see them step into their own. But I'm beginning to realize, I just turned 61, and that's not that old, but it's over 60. I get a senior discount in some places, and I'm realizing, I don't know how many projects I have left. Mm-hmm. And so I'm wanting to shed the noise and focus on the things that most matter now. So I think that the specter of death, the specter of ending, means that I want the years that remain to be done in the work that I most want to do, have it be the work that's the most joyful and the most aligned with who I am and what I'm meant to contribute. And then of course I've faced death in my family and in communities, and you realize that this impermanence, if handled healthily, it yields from grief to joy and gratefulness. So part of my journey is to make sure I get through the grieving process, that I grieve completely.
Say a little bit more about that, because that's really a sort of a thread line through so many of the conversations in this series, is the necessary role of grief in full celebration of life. Yeah. And I just interviewed Joanna Macy as part of this series just 5 days ago. And of course, yeah, that's so much of what her work's about. Say anything more you want to say about that.
Well, I as a culture, I think we try to avoid grief generally. And in my experience, I've had many huge losses in my life. And during the time I'm experiencing them, the one thing that kind of keeps me going is realizing I've lost things before, and there is life, that this will create soil that allows life to emerge. So having that thought is helpful to me during times of grief. But I'm realizing that as a culture, we have a lot to grieve, right? We're grieving literally our dreams of the past. We imagined ourselves to be a certain way, and we're not that, So, and the grief cycle it starts with denial, and it moves into other things, but it starts with denial, and it ends up in anger, and eventually in acceptance and commitment. And so you can't get to acceptance and commitment fully unless you get through the rest of it. And those difficult emotions, I feel, one of the advantages of being over age 40 these days is you've probably experienced a loss, that you then know that loss isn't forever. I mean, you lose something or someone, but eventually you can live again. And when you're young, a loss feels like life is over. You don't realize that you can come back.
Yeah.
So I guess what I would say is grief is all part of the journey. And if we can learn to grieve fully, I feel like we can move into our creativity and joy. And I don't want to philosophize about it. I will just say from my own experience, when I've experienced loss, what helps me through it and what helps me live again is creativity. So creative expression. I have a whole host of paintings that I won't show anyone that have allowed me to grieve and get through the grieving process. Yeah. So I think creativity has a role to play in that too. And maybe that's the role we're playing, as a culture as well, is that we need our creativity right now. We need our artists and our poets to be fully out there and fully creative.
Yeah. Amen.
Yeah.
Yeah. I'm reminded of Joanna's quote that the measure of your grief is a measure of your love, that you wouldn't be experiencing the grief if you weren't reminded of your profound interrelatedness, interconnection, and your love ultimately.
Yeah. One of the things that we forget too is that not everybody has read Joanna Macy, and not everybody, there are a lot of people in our culture that are literally struggling for their next meal. We get the luxury of talking about what we think and feel about the future, when there are people literally in my community who don't know whether they have a meal. They don't know whether they have a roof over their head, and we don't have a lot of services here to offer them. So, some of the people have been left behind in a variety of ways. And one of the ways is they don't have connections, or they've burned those connections in the past because of their own behavior or their own addictions or whatever.
Right, exactly.
So, yeah. So there's a lot to dig out from. And, I've seen story after story. I happen to believe that any one person who overcomes their own demons is celebrated by the universe in a massive way, right? It's just, when you see somebody who's managed to walk that walk and get through that process and then help others, and they're so gracious with other people. So there's a lot of opportunity for that. And when we bring people together, even in small ways, they might find someone who supports them.
Yeah. Amen. Well, I want to use this as an opportunity to lean a little more deeply into what you just touched on, which is sort of the stages of grief begin with denial, and go through anger, bargaining, depression, ultimately acceptance, and then many of us find the gift on the other side of acceptance. Yeah. And I'm curious, what has opened up for you on the other side of what I'm calling the post-doom doorway? Like, you've already touched on some of it, but what's opened up for you? What do you see as are some of the gifts in this challenging time?
That's a great question too. One of the things that you may have talked about with others is that, some people have a profound moment where they dip right into that grief. And for me, that moment, I went to Sophia Center, right? So I studied Thomas Berry. I was in classes with Drew Dillinger, and we learned from Brian Swim, and it was just an amazing time. And it was all, at some level, pretty intellectual. Mm-hmm. I then went for 2 weeks to Genesis Farm, Mary McGillis at Genesis Farm. And while I was there was a class on genetics with Larry Edwards. And somewhere in that class, something clicked inside me that where I realized, oh my gosh, the story is in the DNA. The story is sacred and it's all there. And I just immediately fell into grief and started to cry, realizing all that we've done, just how arrogant humans had been with this sacred story that was told in the form of the DNA. And I'd gone into this grief, and Larry had come up to me, I think it was at lunchtime, and he goes, he says, I see something's happened here. He goes, this often happens. And I realized, yeah, that's where I was. I was in this, moment of sort of awakening. And I made a commitment at that time that I would work for planet Earth in whatever form that meant. And I didn't know what that meant at the time. And literally there have been so many things asked of me that, as I move forward. So I think the gift, once you dip into the grief and you really feel it.
Roughly what year?
I think that would have been 2002.
Okay.
Yeah. So, and really prior to that, I wasn't political. I was working on technology. I was working in the energy industry. I mean, I was working on solar and things like that, but I was, I was very, very intellectual with my saving of the planet. And now my saving of the planet had become deeply personal.
Yeah.
And so what comes out of the other side, for me, is more commitment, but also more peace, realizing that I'm one person. And that was the gift of permaculture. I'm one person doing what I'm called to do and eliciting that from others, hopefully. And if everyone steps up, we will have done our best. And that is what is. If everyone steps up, but the key is working in joy, to work in the things that bring us to life personally. So to not spend our energies and become miserable at it, but to step into what brings us life and what brings us joy. That was the gift for me, is the realization that, I didn't have to save the whole world. I could just work on what was mine to do. Yeah. And so that one gift was amazing, because I would worry, I'd have the weight of the world on my shoulders. I would worry about the whole world.
Yeah, sure.
I always worried about the world. And I didn't need to do that anymore. I could worry about, what I was working on. So,
yeah.
And for some people, myself included, there are times when we have spent ourselves so far, we've burned out, that we can't, when you ask us to make a list of what lights us up, it's really hard to figure that out. It's like, wow, what would be on that list? And at those moments, my prescription for myself is extreme self-care. So when you get to a place where you don't even know what lights you up anymore, that's when you just treat yourself as if you were a child. Get sleep, eat well, do play if you can. And so those moments, there are times in my life where I put so much energy into something that I lost track of myself. And it's then that I need to go back to extreme self-care and just really invest in recovering. Yeah. That's
great coaching. Yeah, that's good stuff.
Yeah, well, that's how I do it. And actually that's the gift. It's the real gift for me, is that if I go off that edge and I realize that I've gotten to a place where I can't give anymore, and the signals are I'm irritable, or I'm not laughing, I get to that place where somebody cracks a joke and I don't find it funny. I realize, oh my gosh, there's a sign that I really need to find some self-care in this.
Yeah, amen. Wow. Well, last question I have on my things to ask you related to what do you see? I'm curious. What do you see as like beyond where we can make a difference anymore? It's the tipping point is already passed, or that there's no realistic chance that that's still in our control. And yet there still are things that are very much individually or collectively sort of where we still can make a difference. So what's your sense of what's no longer possible, and then what still is possible?
Yeah. Well, first of all, I don't think it's an either or. I do think that we have already impacted climate, for example, to the that future generations are going to have a rough time. But what we do now is make it easier, because there's going to be some years of recovery here, and there will be ecosystems lost, there will be whole species, lots of species lost, But if we can contribute now, maybe there won't be so many. So maybe, maybe there'll be some recovery that's possible. So I do believe we've already overshot in some places. But on the other hand, nature is remarkable. And to the extent that we can retain some pristine ecosystems, some old growth forests, it's been proven that if you can keep some, for example, some parts of the ocean untouched, that other parts of the ocean can regenerate from those places. And so, part of our job is to really understand where we can place our energy for the least change for the greatest effect, right? The least energy for the most impact. And, I personally think that's in preserving what we have left and in restoring what was lost. And so if we do that, we at least will make an impact on future generations. They may well curse us and thank us at the same time.
Yeah, and I think of it as holy work, even if our species goes extinct. It's pro.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
How much of the biosphere can we save? I think we could save a good part of it. And there still are old growth forests that exist. There still are intact parts of the sea. There still are wetlands, and there are places that are really still pristine, and it's our job to make sure they stay that way.
Well, and it's, I think one of the things that, as I think you remember, Connie's work is so central to is this
migration.
What tree or plant or shrub do you love? Like, especially native trees, but what tree do you love? And then find some seeds, get some seeds that are further south that are more heat adapted, and then plant them further north. In other words, assisting trees in their necessary migration, poleward, to keep cool, is something that's holy work. Humans can do it, and it doesn't require a lot of effort, and you can actually save species. There's nothing threatening about this. It's not an invasive issue. Trees have been migrating north and south for millions and millions and millions of years.
And up and down elevations as well.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah. That's amazing work, and it's so good. We're in this adventure together. I'm going to do my best to look at it as an adventure and say, what's mine to do now? Fly the airplane. See if we can pull up.
Yeah, no, exactly. I mean, that's sort of the way, as I mentioned, I see doom as the midpoint between denial and regeneration. Regeneration with or without us, that's what life does. But post-doom, I see as the space that opens up in our hearts and in our lives when we remember who we are, accept what's inevitable, and then invest in what is pro-future and soul nourishing.
Pro-life, pro-life. And it's all a story. We're all part of an unfolding story. And that you asked earlier, how did that inform me? I realize we're all a story. Everything's a story. And that's what Thomas Berry said. It's all a story.
One of the early people that I interviewed in this series was Shaun Chamberlin. He offered a frame that I found very useful, which is the question, what story do you want your life to tell?
Yeah.
That thinking mythically, what story do I want my life to tell?
Yeah.
And participating in the larger story that is all of our story.
That's right. And I had a friend who was a Jungian. Yeah, he's recently died, but he used to ask the question. Here we are. Our culture is living the hero's journey over and over and over again. It's in all of our movies. It's in all of it. In fact, they teach it like to the movie makers, right? Our culture is so connected to the hero's journey that everybody's taught how to use it. And my question and his was, how do we resolve that myth so we can move into a new myth? Because the myth of the hero's journey is the one we're living, and we're going to keep living it until we resolve it. Yeah. That was his view. Yeah. And the new myth may look a whole lot more like the parts of Avatar where the forest is coming to life. Not the part where the hero had to shoot everything up, but the part of Avatar where life was speaking and life was emerging and there was this connective thing happening. That may be the new myth. We just don't know how that myth plays yet. We're still in the myth of the hero's journey. So we have to resolve the myth. And I don't know what it means to resolve the myth, but I think it means living it. We are literally as a culture living it. It's why those stories so resonate with us. They're death to life stories. We have to understand what that means for us before we can move on.
This has been a post-doom conversation. For more audios and videos of post-doom conversations and other resources along these lines, go to postdoom.org. www.theology.com.